During the second half of World War II, Japanese fighters struggled somewhat to keep up with the threat of super high-altitude strategic bombing and increasingly capable Allied escort fighters. The Ki-61 was the Japanese Army's primary fighter at the time, and upgraded models had fairly good performance, but the Kawasaki inline engines it used suffered massive problems. They were using licensed-produced engines based on the German DB601, but just never really got them to a good level of reliability, and for a variety of reasons, the production quality was really low. Compounding this challenge, the most common types of failures weren't serviceable in the field, and required the engines to be sent back to the factory for repair, which was a logistical nightmare. As an emergency stopgap, a few fresh Ki-61 airframes were cobbled together with late-model Mitsubishi Kinsei radial engines. These engines, which were designated the HA-112 in Army service, had a pretty firmly established logistics setup, were very reliable, included a turbo supercharger, and delivered pretty good performance. Some slight modifications were made to the forward fuselage of the plane to fit the wider engine, along with a few more minor alterations to maintain the center of gravity. But when it first flew, this new plane immediately impressed the test pilots. Every area of performance was improved by a noticeable level over the Ki-61, with the sole exception of absolute top-end speed. The plane was named Ki-100, and despite being very slightly slower than the Ki-61, it climbed better, was more maneuverable, had excellent dive performance, and operated well at high altitudes. The first batch of Ki-100s were converted Ki-61 airframes, but it eventually had a dedicated production run with some slight modifications. The plane maintained a positive win rate in air combat, and most historians consider it one of the top 2 or 3 best Japanese fighters of the war. What we're looking at in War Thunder is the Ki-100, a fighter in rank 3 of the Japanese tech tree at battle rating 4.0. This video is focusing on the tech tree version based on the converted Ki-61 airframes, but there is a premium Ki-100 based on the dedicated production run I mentioned that's broadly similar. The primary armament in the Ki-100 is a pair of 20mm HO5 cannons and a pair of 12.7mm HO103 machine guns. You get a fairly typical selection of ammo belts for both, and my usual preference is the air targets belt on the machine guns and the universal belt on the cannons. These give a healthy mix of armor-piercing and explosive rounds, even if the overall firepower isn't very impressive. For loadouts, you get 2 external hardpoints that can carry a pair of light bombs, from 50 to 250 kilograms, which is fairly typical for a mid-tier Japanese fighter. Nothing impressive, but it's still a little extra flexibility. In terms of its flight performance, the Ki-100 ends up being an interesting aircraft with a couple of odd trade-offs. As I mentioned during the historical info, this is a Ki-61 with a radial engine. It loses a bit in absolute top-end speed, and most other fighters in this BR range can outrun the thing in a flat chase, but the rate of climb is okay, and it's a fairly stable gunnery platform. The energy retention is better than a lot of the planes it flies against, and overall agility is slightly above average. You've still got to watch out for Spitfires forcing you into a turn fight, but with careful ACM, you can usually do pretty well in a one-on-one without any really serious shortcomings from the plane itself. Speaking generally, this ends up being one of those planes with just enough performance to be credibly okay at most types of flying, but not enough to be really great at any of them. The slightly reduced top-end speed is the only real disadvantage, and due to its BR placement, it ends up being just incredibly average. You can drop combat flaps up to about 280 kilometers an hour without worrying, and if you use the manual engine controls, you can tweak a little bit of extra cooling. But as always, taking external bomb loads is going to kneecap the flight performance a bit, but otherwise, no real caveats with the flight performance. It's also worth mentioning that in arcade battles, the flight performance of this plane is significantly better, enough so that it's bumped up to BR 4.7 in arcade battles. 2 whole steps. So if you're an AB flyer, enjoy this one. Now, taking this plane out into air battles really shows off its flexibility. You have just enough performance to do almost anything. Now, it can be a struggle to catch bombers who know how to climb, and a lot of opponents can outrun you in a flat chase if they want to deny an engagement, but usually only after building up some speed first. The Ki-100 does fairly well with boom and zoom tactics if you can build an altitude advantage early in the match, and it's a great dogfighter against the majority of planes at its BR. Not the best at these tactics, but good enough for most of them. I know it sounds kind of cliche and lazy to say, but this plane really is a kind of jack of all trades but master of none situation. It's really well balanced. There is one issue though. Its firepower can be a little unimpressive. The hitting power of the twin cannons twin machine gun combo feels a little behind the curve at this BR, and sometimes you kind of need to pump the target if you're not getting solid hits with the cannons. This can become an issue against bombers, and if you can manage it, the best bet is to try and shoot off a wing rather than throwing shots into the fuselage. The good news is, if you can get a couple of solid hits on a fighter with the cannons, it's usually enough. In terms of ground attack, this is another case where I'm going to say not to bother in air battles. There are strike planes and bombers at this BR which can do it much better than the 2 small bombs you get, and carrying them hurts the flight performance enough to cripple your flying. In close air support, it's a bit more practical as you can get to the action faster and dump the bombs, then go fly air superiority. But in air battles, just leave the bombs at home. Visually, the Ki-100's kind of an interesting aircraft. I've always liked radial engine designs, and I find the shape really appealing, with the basic Japanese green paint job looking pretty good, as always, on a prop fighter. The streamlined fairing behind the cockpit is a little weird, but overall it's still a good-looking plane. Landing is basic for a tail dragon prop, and you've got to be very light on the brakes to avoid nosing over forward after touching down. You can drop gear at about 250 kilometers an hour, and landing flaps a little slower than that. The cockpit on this plane kind of annoyed me a bit. The instrument panel really rides up farther than I like, and some of the forward bracing ended up being really obstructive. Finding the instruments was easy when I needed them, but looking outside of the plane was kind of a chore. Not really a fan of this cockpit. To close out on the Ki-100. This plane has good maneuverability in a dogfight, a generous supply of ammunition, and it adapts well to changing combat situations. However, it's got fairly low overall firepower, and its top-end speed isn't that great. The final verdict on the Ki-100 is that this plane really can fly almost any playstyle in any game mode. You can anchor a Japanese lineup around this one with only minimal practice. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.